This is level 2 of the CFA program, the topic on corporate issuers, and the reading on corporate governance and other ESG considerations in investment analysis. This reading fits perfectly in the series of readings that we've just covered. Recall that in our capital budgeting reading, we talked about the importance of executives finding positive net present value projects. In the capital structure reading, we discovered the importance of the right-hand side of the balance sheet and the great contributions of Modigliani and Miller. In the dividend policy and share repurchase readings, we discovered how important it is that executives share the profitability, share the cash flows by distributing earnings to shareholders. And in this reading, we're going to take the natural step. And here's the analogy that I would like you to consider. I remember when I was a little dude in the old days, my grandmother would have me over for dinner, and she would make cabbage soup. And I remember thinking, Graham, this is just so disgusting. And so, but when she put it in front of me, it didn't look like cabbage soup. It looked like something that was really fantastic, and I loved it. And so I want you to think about this. Cabbage soup, what my grandmother did was put some ground meat into it, and she would have some noodles, and then she would have a bunch of vegetables, including cabbage. And so I want you to think of the ground beef as the capital budgeting. I want you to think of the noodles as capital structure. And I want you to think of all the vegetables as dividend policy and share repurchases. So what could we do as a good cook? I mean, my grandmother had an amazing ability to put those in the right proportions with the right salt and the right other spices. And so that's what we're doing here under corporate governance. We have good capital budgeting. We have good capital structure. We have good dividend policy. Now we need to answer the following questions. Let's suppose that I'm a scientist for a company that does personal hygiene products, and I come up with a molecule for a bar of soap that's going to completely eliminate body odor in teenagers. This sounds like a great idea. Sounds like it will be a positive net present value project. The question that we're answering here is, what is the process under which this idea in my brain gets all the way through the structure until it ends up on the shelves at a retailer, and consumers come in and they look at this product and they say, I need to have 10 of these. I need to have 20 of these. I need to stock up. And this is what corporate governance is. It's a series of rules and regulations and ideas and culture that design and encourage and motivate this entire mix of, what did I say, ground beef and noodles and vegetables, and put it together in some kind of a beautiful soup so that the consuming public will want to sustainably invest and purchase our product line over time. And then, of course, the second part of this is the ESG considerations, which, of course, everyone knows is a huge issue, especially over the last, let's say 2 decades. What we're trying to do is layer all of this stuff. I want you to think about my grandmother's soup and the smell coming up. And we're trying to layer that with these other considerations. All right, so is the environment important? Yes. Are social issues important? Yes. Governance issues important? Yes. So these are the aroma that comes out, and we need to identify that aroma, which is going to be a super challenge because we have to do this quantitatively and qualitatively. So this reading is really kind of generalized summary of what we have been doing over these last couple of readings, and then it adds another layer. It's a relatively short reading, and so we only have 4 LOSs here. Describe global variation in ownership structure. So this is going to be, all right, what does the board of directors look like? What do these individuals do, and how do they contribute to the overall taste of our cabbage soup? Corporate governance policies, of course. And then towards the end of the slide deck, we'll look specifically at ESG-related risk exposures and then some investment opportunities. All right, I think I answered these brief recaps here. Corporate governance, a collection of rules and policies, et cetera, right? And used to control and operate a corporation. So here's the idea. What's the goal of the business? Maximize shareholder wealth, which means we're going to find projects that have lots and lots of cash flows. So we need to decide, how does corporate governance, how does the composition of the board of directors, how does the idea go from my brain of a molecule into a bar of soap? How does that impact cash flows? And then, of course, we have social and governance and other governance issues and the environment to consider that will either increase or decrease these investment opportunities and essentially the stock's risk. All right, I bet you know all this stuff back from level one. So let's take a look at the different types of ownership. So dispersed ownership. So just think of LeBron James when before a basketball game, he goes over to the thing and he puts all that stuff in his hands so that the ball doesn't slip, and he goes like this, and it disperses all over the place. So that's where shareholders are all over the world. Dispersed ownership. Now, what that probably means is that one of those little flakes that lands way over there probably doesn't have a whole impact on LeBron's ability to catch and shoot the ball. So none of the shareholders has the ability to individually exercise power over the company. All right, think of the opposite of that, of course. Concentrated ownership is when there might be, one or two or maybe a group of controlling shareholders that can exercise substantial power over the company's decision on whether or not to invest in my molecule for that bar of soap. And then some other common structures. Horizontal, of course, we have these strategic alliances. This is super common in companies. And then vertical, controlling interests in some holding corporations that go up and down. And, so think about this here, strategic alliances, and then think of this way as kind of like maybe a supply chain in one direction or another. And then lastly, we can take a look at some kinds of differences in classes of stock. I remember being in graduate school, one of our professors said you can have class A shares or class B shares. And I remember thinking, why would you want to own class B shares? And then my professor said, well, you're probably right, Jim, but think about it this way. If you have one share of stock that says, okay, you have one share and you get 100 votes versus another class where you have one share and just one vote, well, maybe you'd want that secondary class because you can rely on the expertise of those first classes. I guess that's true for some cases, but nevertheless, some people have inferior or actually no voting rights in these dual classes. Here's a really, really good exam question here. Conflict with different ownership structures. Let's suppose we have dispersed ownership and dispersed voting power. So think of LeBron. We got that whole thing going all the way out into the crowd. And look for these. Go down this left-hand column here. Look for these up in the vignette where this institute will describe an ownership structure, and they'll have to use the word dispersed or dispersed somewhere in there. So what does this mean? We're going to have probably inconsequential shareholders. The reading uses the term weak, and strong managers. And of course, this is the classic case of a principal agent problem in which there's this agency conflict in which the executives, the financial managers, are going to do things like excessively consume perks. A couple of ways that this can be managed if there are some controlling shareholders or if there's a strong board of directors. And we'll talk about the board here in just a few minutes. How about if we have concentrated ownership and concentrated voting power? Well, this is just the opposite, right? Strong shareholders and weak managers. And then, of course, there's going to be a different principal agent problem in which the controlling owners can influence the allocation of resources to their own kind of maybe pet projects or their own kind of excessive consumption, et cetera, et cetera. How about dispersed ownership and concentrated voting power? This is strong controlling shareholders, but they don't have majority shares. And this probably occurs through that dual class issue that I described before. And of course, there can be some agency conflict here as well. How about finally concentrated ownership and dispersed voting power? This probably only occurs when there are voting caps inside of the governance structure. There's a good section in the reading on types of influential shareholders, and I'm guessing that we know about all of these things because they pop up somewhere in the CFA program. We know about banks, of course, they're influential, and then skip down to the bottom there, institutional investors. So pension funds and mutual funds and hedge funds, those are super important these days. And then others as well. This Institute has an entire reading on, or at least a sub-reading on private equity. And then notice down in the bottom right there, managers and board of directors. So let's get back to that board of director composition that I've talked about a little bit before. At least part of my dissertation was written on board of director structure, and this is what I know that I learned when I was writing my dissertation, is that board members essentially have two jobs. Their jobs are to, now this is big picture thing, hire and fire executives. And what I learned writing my dissertation and in doing lots and lots of reading over the years is that good boards consists of two characteristics. One, primarily, is highly skilled individuals, and those highly skilled individuals are independent. So that's what we have in the orange block there. Independent board of directors, which means that they don't work for the company, they don't get paid by the company, and they may or may not own a small number of shares as part of their board of director requirements. But look at that second arrow point. Presence of independent members strengthens corporate governance. And this, of course, is true. What I am going to ask you to do for a homework assignment, I think I've done this in a couple of other recordings, is type in Johnson & Johnson and go look at its board of directors and look at these 13 really, really smart men and women, none of whom have any direct relationship with Johnson & Johnson, and say to yourself, boy, if I'm a J&J shareholder, I trust these individuals to be good stewards. There's a word that's going to pop up later today. To be good monitors of executives, and to be able to come up with a model of corporate governance that's going to be consistent with shareholder wealth maximization. Lots of boards have a one-tier structure. Some boards have two tiers where it's management and supervisory. Some boards have special voting arrangements, improve the power of minority shareholders. I came across this when I was writing my dissertation. Most voting structures include a provision under which if you have one share as an investor, you get one vote. So if there are 10 board of directors, you get the proxy statement and you can just vote for each one of those 10. But under cumulative voting arrangements, what you can do is you can accumulate those. So you take your one vote times the 10 board seats. So that gives you 10 votes, and you can vote them for one. So you would vote all 10 of your votes for one and 0 of your votes for the other 9. And so notice the arrow point improves the power of minority shareholders. So if I only have one vote, my one vote for each of those board candidates is probably not going to be too influential. But if I can assign 10 votes to one of those, then that's a dramatic increase in my power. Governance codes, laws, and listing requirements. Of course, the governing bodies out there, and including the SEC, they require these publicly held corporations to let us know as Mr. and Mrs. Shareholder what we're doing in terms of our corporate governance practices, which includes things like telling us about the committees, right? The audit committee. And in fact, the New York Stock Exchange, I think, was a pioneer in requiring its listed firms to have independent board members serve on the audit committee, because the audit committee is going to go and say, all right, here's what you're producing, and let's make sure that it's accurate. And then, of course, one of the most important committees out there is the compensation committee. And so these board members get together and they arrange for the compensation contracts for the executives. And so those have to provide incentives that are consistent with shareholder wealth maximization. And over the last decade or so, there has been a dramatic increase in the establishment of a risk committee. And this is super important to establish not only this committee, but a risk culture throughout the company in which everybody is thinking about risk. And you can define risk in, maybe not hundreds of ways, but surely tens of different ways. And so it's important to have everybody inside of the organization thinking about risk, and that's the job of the risk committee. And so these governance codes and the stewardship codes, which are voluntary, by the way, these are all just kind of cultural practices that inform and disclose investors and potential investors about all of these corporate governance issues that we're talking about. Now, as good financial analysts, what have we been taught to do in these last series of readings? We've been taught to evaluate cash flows of positive NPV projects, right? Capital budgeting. We've been taught to determine whether or not a firm has its optimal capital structure on the right-hand side of the balance sheet. We have been taught to determine whether or not the firm is optimally paying a dividend or repurchasing its shares, whether in the open market or in one of those short-term ways. Remember, we talked about Dutch auction repurchases and fixed price self-tender offers. And so what we need to do is then take a look at this and say, all right, we know all that stuff, but let's go ahead and become experts in evaluating corporate governance policies and procedures. So we need to identify the important corporate governance issues in each capital market. And that, of course, depends on ownership structure, how many shareholders are out there, what does it look like, history, legal environment, culture. So there's that word that pops up over the last couple of decades, culture meaning not just differences here and there, but what do we identify? What does the corporation identify as being important and what is identified as being less important? And then, of course, industry diversity is a hugely important topic. Here we go. Board of directors structure. This is what I was talking about a little bit earlier. Does the board structure give insight, representation, and accountability to shareholders? What did I say to you just a few moments ago? Their job is to hire and fire executives. I mean, among all of the jobs that the board of boards of directors do, and of course, the main part of that is to establish a strategic plan. Of course, that strategic plan has to be in the short term, and then it has to be in the long term, like a 5-year plan as well. And so look at those words that we have bolded: insight, representation, and accountability. And so let me just go back to that Johnson & Johnson board. Take a look at these really, really smart men and women. And it's pretty obvious to me that you're going to say yes to insight, yes to representation, and yes to accountability. Now, of course, you can't just get the full picture just by looking at what is presented in the annual report. You need to go and make certain that these board members are operating in an efficient manner. Look at that second green arrow point there. This is a really important one. Take a look at the Johnson & Johnson board. Does the CEO also serve as the chairperson of the board? And this, in fact, is true, at least in 2021 for Johnson & Johnson. And so here's the big question. It's probably okay if there's this CEO duality, if there is an intense monitoring of all of those kinds of processes. And that's why it's important to have independent board members on that audit committee and that compensation committee, and probably the corporate governance committee as well. But I will say that there is a move to separate those two roles, CEO and chair of the board, which is probably a good thing. Although there is some history here that, of course, the CEO knows the most about the operations of the business and therefore would be able to accurately, at least efficiently, you would hope, set the agenda for all of the board meetings. But again, this is probably evaluated on a case-by-case basis. And so if you read this in a vignette, there'll probably be a sentence in there. They'll give you, the Institute will give you this dual role. And somewhere in there, they'll say something like, oh, the CEO is not a very nice person, and he or she does these kinds of things. So that'll be an indication that they probably should be separated. Board independence. Oh boy, I've emphasized this, right? The absence or presence of a minority of independent directors signifies negative corporate governance. And I think, once again, New York Stock Exchange was a pioneer in leading the surge from, if you go back to, let's say, 1980 or so, I think only about 20 or 25% of board members were independent. But if you go to, let's say, 2020, I mean, it's an overwhelming majority of the 75%, maybe 80%. In fact, that Johnson & Johnson, the CEO in 2021 is the only internal board member. The other 13 are all external. Board committees, I've mentioned this multiple times here, ensure the selection of sufficiently independent directors to concentrate on key governance concerns. Okay. Of course, non-independent, or we used to call these back in the old days in the academic world, these internal board members, of course, leads to conflict of interest. And this could be summarized in what I just said, right? Let's suppose that the board is entirely made up of internal members. So it's the board's job to hire and fire themselves. Well, that's probably not an efficient way to do things. Board skills and experience. Go back to the Johnson & Johnson board. I mean, these individuals, they are super long on talent and they're super long on experience. Now, one of the concerns here is that if you have a board member who has been on the board for 100 years, look at that last arrow point, they may be too closely aligned with management. Of course, these boards, the committees and the board in its entirety meets a bunch of times during the course of the year. So, of course, they develop personal relationships with the CEO and other executives, and probably lots and lots of financial managers, and maybe even people that work for the company throughout. So there's a concern then that they become too chummy and that they'll lose their general objective of hiring and firing those. Board composition, so we have professional, cultural, geographical background, gender, age, and tenure. And so a diversified board, of course, is extremely important. Boy, what did I say? This compensation committee or the remuneration committee, they get to pick, right? So the board can say to the executives, they can say, hey, we'll pay you $1 billion a year, right? That's the board's job. However, shareholders ought to have at least some say in this. So there are some provisions that have passed in annual meetings. This say no pay gives the shareholders a chance to vote on some kind of a general compensation package. Shareholder voting rights. This is what I was telling you earlier about. Grants the shareholder one vote for each share, cumulative shareholding or dual class. So. All right, how about the second part of this reading focuses on the ESG-related exposures. So here's the first question is, as good financial analysts, how do we even go about trying to figure out what is important environmentally and socially and governance issues? And so the idea is that we're going to find these things in publicly available documents, like the annual report or SEC filings, or just regular old communications with the investment banking community. And so the reality of life is that we need to figure out what is important and what is not important. And the reading uses the word and the term materiality. So we're going to have either positive information that comes out of environmental or social issues, or we're going to have negative information that comes out. So what we need to do as good financial analysts is to attack this just like we did with capital budgeting. Determine how it's going to impact cash flows and ultimately stock price. And so oftentimes positive information that relates to the environment, this may or may not be material, but negative information almost always is material. So we need to worry about things like pollution, right? So let's suppose that, I'm an executive for a company that makes something like soap. And I have a factory, and I have a smokestack up there, and then I have waste water. So the concern is that the carbon gets into the atmosphere, and then the pollution gets into the stream. And so the question then becomes, how is that going to impact the cash flows of this company, not just today, but over the next decade? Because clearly, if I'm polluting into the air and into the waters, that it's not going to go unnoticed, right? So somebody is going to come along and say, hey, look what Jim's doing. And then I'm going to have this terrible impact on my cash flows, because people are going to look at me and say, you know what, Jim doesn't care about the environment, so then we're not going to buy his soap. Oh man, this is going to have a tremendous impact. You ready for this? Back to capital budgeting, back to capital structure, because if I have to issue a bond, bondholders are going to say, you know what, Jim, we don't really want to participate. But if you really want our money, you're going to have to pay us 25% yield to maturity, right? And then dividends. Who knows if I can pay a dividend or repurchase shares if I don't have the cash flow? And so I envision this vignette to have a scenario under which there's probably some negative information related to an E, an S, or a G, and then we're going to have to probably identify and say, what are the likely impacts on things like cash flows, things like reputation. So there's the quantitative part and there's the qualitative part. So look what we have under investment horizon: the securities valuation in the near term, all right, and then maybe over into the long term as well. Now, how about relevant ESG related factors? So the question then becomes, if you are the good financial analyst and you're evaluating my company, Jim's Soap Company, I mean, what can you do? I mean, you could drive to my headquarters and look at my factory, and you could take a kayak into the little creek out there, and you could measure the pollution that's coming in, and then you could get your net and you could capture the carbon up there. But that sounds like a lot of work. And so what you're probably going to do, look at the second bullet point. There are lots of organizations out there that provide ESG data. So much like Moody's, we'll just go out and pay for this data. We can also rely on some not-for-profits out there. These are organizations that monitor pollution, they monitor social issues. And then as good financial analysts, we might have proprietary methods under which we can, instead of coming and doing all this work in a kayak, maybe we can evaluate things like, bid-ask prices on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, maybe spreads over in the bond market. Maybe we can try to quantify this from some proprietary method, whether they're statistical or some other quantitative method. I thought this was one of the more interesting parts of this reading, that there is a difference between security analysis on the equity side versus the fixed income side as it relates to these ESG risk factors. So notice that first circle point. They will differ for debt and equity analysis. So over on the equity side, what we're trying to do as good financial analysts is to identify, here, let me just go back quickly here. Identify negative ESG information that's going to materially impact cash flows, right? So we want to manage this downside risk. So we might use things like value at risk or some other manner to take a look at things that happen on the left-hand side of that bell-shaped curve, or any kind of other distribution that we might be faced with. However, we want to also couple that with identifying potential opportunities. Find companies that have managed the social issues and the environmental issues that may not be reflected in that stock price or that bond price. And so one of the cool things about this analysis is that we'll be able to, like, what's the goal of fundamental analysis? Identify overpriced firms and underpriced firms. Well, we could do this here inside of just this ESG analysis. So that's important for equity analysis. Remember, alleviates downside risk and identifies potential opportunities, which goes exactly with what the Institute has been teaching us all along. So look at that second circle point. Financial metrics and ratios, valuation models, sensitivity analysis, and scenario analysis. Oh my gosh, I love that Excel spreadsheet where we change one variable and recompute stock price or net present value or spreads or whatever it is. But fixed income analysis, we're primarily focused on just alleviating downside risk. And so the big concern, of course, is that, all right, we invest in this company's bonds and they have a BBB rating and we can say, hey, these are investment grade bonds. And then all of a sudden we have, here, let me go back again. Here we have a negative material ESG release of information. And so all of a sudden our bonds are now downgraded to BB and then single B. We now have speculative graded bonds. And so this is no good. So the focus on the bond side is to alleviate downside risk. All right, let's keep going on how we do this. What's kind of the chronology of identifying these factors? So identifying the ESG factors affecting not only a company, but its industry as well. And so it's probably easier to start at the industry level and say, okay, there's Jim's soap company. How many other companies make soap? What is their stance on carbon capture? What is their stance on hiring scientists to come in and evaluate the water quality of the stream that runs through its backyard? So we're going to forecast and we're going to use historical data. And once again, we'll probably rely on others out there as well. Now, what we'll do is we'll take that data and we'll adjust the company's financial statements. Oh my gosh, this is the hard part here. The quantitative adjustment of those financial statements, and then we're going to make a decision of whether the stock is over or undervalued based on that adjusted financial performance. Now, granted, those 3 steps right there, they sound super simple on this slide, but it's quite a complex process. And then let's look at this last LOS, green bonds. These have been become very popular and common in the last decade, in which a company says something like, hey, we want to issue a bond. We're going to invest in a positive net present value project, but these funds are specifically designed to benefit either the general climate or our local environment. So these are called green bonds. And these have become very popular, and lots of investors who are concerned about climate change invest in these bonds. And so what do? They bid up the price. And so the yield on these may be low or may not be, depends on the positivity of the positive net present value project. But that also brings up the concept of greenwashing. Greenwashing doesn't sound like a great term, and it's probably not. And this is just a fancy way of saying that the executives are faking us out. Notice that we have in bold, they will not go to projects that benefit climate. They just tell us that they're going to go greenwashing. Those of you who are following or who followed the 2021 ExxonMobil proxy contest, in which a couple of board members were elected who were elected as proponents of handling the environment and climate change issues, critics say, boy, this could be greenwashing. I'm hopeful that it's not, but anyway. So I think that takes us through the learning outcome statements. Boy, what are the important ones here? I mean, I would say that if this is one vignette with 6 questions, I would say probably 4 questions are on corporate governance issues and then 2 questions on ESG issues.